Well, in humans, we have what's called the respiratory occlusion reflex. As you can see here, the infants in this reflex, we have as with all reflexes, a stimulus. In this case, the infant's face gets covered with, say, a blanket or something, and the infant begins to thrash its head back and forth. If the stimulus remains in place, the infant then brings its arms up and starts thrashing its arms around the front of the face. If this doesn't work, that is, the infant's face is still covered, then the infant lets out a terrible wail of a noise. Now, we call this respiratory occlusion reflex for a good reason. It's obviously what's happening here is it's not just the face being covered, but actually being covered sufficiently to prevent breathing, occlude respiration, prevent breathing. This one was discovered, oddly enough, in the 1960s, and it's kind of an interesting story behind it, in that, well, let me back up even further. Mothers stopped breastfeeding right in the United States in particular, right around World War II. Now, there was some bottle feeding going on prior to the Second World War, but the Second World War really made it popular. What we had going on, of course, was lots of young men going off to war, leaving women to work in the factories. As you also know in our history, this is a time in which women going into the workplace really took off also. Simply, and when the men came back, women did not leave the factories, did not leave jobs. Women now, after a generation of women working, they wanted to continue working. And so it was a major sociological shift in the United States, from women staying home raising families to the majority of women now in the workplace. Anyway, back to respiratory occlusion. So what we needed in this country was a way to conveniently and easily feed a lot of babies. Remember, this was also the time of the baby boom. Lots of new babies being born as these young men were headed off to war. So the United States government asked Nestle and Carnation to come up with baby formulas, which they did. We add it to cow's milk and make a healthy baby formula. The factories in the United States at the time, primarily dedicated to producing items for war, and with lots of women factory workers, also sponsored daycare centers, so the women would bring their infants to the daycare center, and one or two women then could bottle feed, hundreds of babies, even thousands of babies at the factory's daycare center. So we had bottle fed. Of course, after the bottle feeding during World War II, nobody really wanted to go back to breastfeeding, or very few did, until the 60s. And in the 1960s, we had this back to nature movement, the flower children, the precursors to the hippies. And the flower children were all about back to nature. They want to get back to natural stuff. So breastfeeding, of course, now becomes popular again, at least among this subculture in the United States and throughout Europe. So the difficulty is that after a generation of not breastfeeding, that is, mothers who didn't breastfeed, these new young teeny bopper mothers, and really the back to nature, flower children mothers, didn't have a whole lot of skill in this area. And their parents weren't real good because the parents bottle fed them. The problem was that when they go to feed their baby, the baby wouldn't take the breast. It just simply would not suck on the nipple. And these young mothers were going back to the doctor saying, my baby doesn't like my breast milk. It's just not working. Well, the doctors, trying to figure out what was going on here, why it was like, in fact, at one point the CDC said we had an epidemic of babies not taking the breast, and as you can imagine, a lot of the media said, oh my goodness, it's because we've had a bottle-fed generation, and that's just ruined all babies forever on taking breast milk. Ridiculous stuff like that. As it turns out, it was the respiratory occlusion reflex. These young mothers, not really paying attention to what they were doing, I guess, were putting the baby on the breast milk, but covering up its nose. Now, to their credit, you have to remember the breasts get engorged with milk during pregnancy towards the last trimester, and boy, they can get really big and floppy, and it's hard to see down past these big things on your chest. So the poor baby is down there trying to get milk, but it's also pushing its nose into the breast and can't get it. Of course, if you try to hold the baby even tighter against the breast, you're only making matters worse, and rather than thrashing its head back and forth, meaning not taking the nipple, it now is going to raise its little arms up and beat on your breast, right? So you can see why these young mothers were saying, my baby doesn't like me, my baby doesn't like my milk, It just screams and cries and beats on me whenever I try to feed it. The respiratory occlusion reflex. Once we discovered what it was pretty easy to tell the mothers when you go to breastfeed, make sure you put one hand under the baby's head, and as you bring it up to the breast, take your other hand and with your finger depress your breast in a little bit so that the baby has an air channel, right? So make sure the nose is exposed, or at least the nostrils, so the baby can breathe while it's feeding. We now actually give these instructions with diagram to all mothers of newborns, and I'm sure many of you have received these instructions as you took your babies home with you from the hospital. So what about the interacting reflexes, our fourth type of reflex? Again, a classic example in interacting reflexes comes from herring gulls. The herring gull feeding is an example of interacting reflex, and in this case, the interacting reflexes is when two or more individuals are exhibiting a reflex. Let's review this one with the herring gulls. Herring gulls is our basic seagull, by the way, and the herring gull is most populous in the rocky coasts of Oregon and Washington, Northern California. They live up on the rocky cliff right along the coastline. They go out twice a day to feed, in morning and evening, and of course they fly around in big circles over the water, and when they see fish near the surface of the water, they dive down and catch fish. They then return to the nest, okay, and feed their young through regurgitation. Now, let's stop and talk about how all this takes place. The herring gull, when they have young in the nest as part of their hormonal system of having eggs and laying eggs, raising young, both male and female, by the way, exhibit a red spot on their beaks. So this red spot is sometimes a kind of a black dot, sometimes disappears entirely, until it's time, until breeding season rolls around. And now this little dark spot, or no spot at all, starts getting redder and redder, brighter and brighter, and by the time the babies hatch, there's a really bright red spot on the beak of the herring gulls. Well, when the herring gull returns from their morning or evening feeding back to the nest, of course what they've done is they've eaten the fish themselves, and so they use what we call regurgitation feeding, or vomiting. So they simply vomit into the bottom of the nest. Okay. Now what causes this vomit? Why do they do this? Well, when they return to the nest, the baby birds see the red spot and begin pecking at it. So the red spot is a stimulus that elicits pecking from the baby birds. Okay. Now you may, when you see it, you may say, oh, it looks like they're begging for food. They're pecking at mommy's mouth or daddy's mouth. Well, yes, but it's a reflex, that red dot. Right, if we go in and paint over the red dot with yellow paint, the poor baby chicks never ask for food and never get any. It is a stimulus that elicits a reflex of pecking. Now, there's a reflex in the parent bird also, so that when the infant pecks the red spot, this is a stimulus that elicits vomiting from the parent. So the parent now vomits right there in the nest. You can imagine it's probably a surprise to the parent, suddenly, vomiting here. So and like, all good animals, if you vomit up your dinner, you just, start eating it again. So the parent bird then goes down and starts eating the vomit in the nest. All the while, the baby birds are tracking that red spot. So as the red spot goes down into the vomit, that's where the baby birds start pecking too. And, of course, they wind up feeding this way. As the beak goes up and down, in and out of the vomit, as the parent bird tries to eat the vomit again, the baby birds are tracking the red spot, and their heads are bobbing up and down, also then eating the vomit as they try to peck a red spot buried in vomit. Phew. So, interacting reflex arc. So what we've seen then, this is kind of a summary slide, what we've seen is 3 levels of complexity of the reflexive behavior. We've seen the simple reflex arc involving 2 or 3 neurons, right? Always, of course, a stimulus responds. We've seen the modal action pattern as our second type, a stimulus that elicits a series of responses in a particular order. And finally, the interacting reflex arc, in which the response of one individual serves as a stimulus for a response in another individual. By the way, you see these baby birds here. The other major form of feeding your babies is not to regurgitate into the bottom of the nest, but actually to regurgitate directly into the mouth of a baby bird, or even as they get older, to bring them solid food, like worms you haven't eaten yet, and poke the worms down the baby bird's mouth. Of course, this only works for baby birds that are old enough to handle solid food. Right? When they're first born, all baby birds have to have the regurgitated vomit from a parent. But whether you vomit at the bottom of the nest or directly into the bird's mouth depends on the species. And in species in which they put it into the baby bird's mouth, as you can see in this picture of these two little baby birds, there's a V-shape, colored V-shape of reds, yellows, and oranges in that mouth, right? And that V-shape serves as a stimulus that causes parents to vomit. So now I'm unsure just what the stimulus is when a bird returns to when a parent bird returns to the nest, is when the baby birds, that's the stimulus then that causes the baby birds to rear their heads up and open their mouths real wide, start the food begging kind of behavior. And as the parents look down at these open mouths below them, they see that little V-shaped colored stimulus, and that is the stimulus that causes the regurgitation response directly into the mouth. Also an interacting reflex arc.